My name is Heather Ramsey. I'm 41. Anthe, last time my sister saw me in uniform, I was 21, graduating basic training, all sharp angles and naive pride. She'd rolled her eyes, whispering to her then boyfriend, loud enough for him to hear. It's such a phase. She'll back working at the mall in a year. 20 years later, we were in a courtroom that felt smaller and colder than any interrogation room I'd ever sat in. It was a probate hearing, a sterile battleground for the soul of my father's legacy. His company, Ramsey Dynamics, was a small but brilliant aerospace engineering firm he'd built from nothing. It was his life's work. I said, and my sister, Megan, was trying to operate from his dead hands and feed it to her husband's corporate machine. Her lawyer, a man with a $5,000 suit and the predatory smile of a barracuda, was painting a masterpiece of my Your Honor, he purred, his voice dripping with condescending pity. We have before us a woman, Heather Ramsey, who has spent her entire adult life adrift. For 2 decades, she has lived a transient existence, a career civil servant, moving from one dusty, forgotten outpost to another. She has no sets to speak of, no roots, no experience in the complex world of corporate governance. I sat at my table, hands folded neatly over a plain leather-bound portfolio. I wore a simple charcoal grey suit, my hair pulled back in a severe, disciplined bun. I remained effectively still, my expression neutral. Inside, a familiar cold fury was coiling in my gut. It was the same fury I'd felt 1,000 times before, at 1,000 holiday dinners and strained family phone calls. Megan sat beside her husband Mark, dabbing at her eyes with a silk handkerchief. She was the picture of grieving, responsible daughterhood. She was always the performer, the golden child, the one who'd stayed home, gone to the right schools. Mariette's right man, a slick defense contractor named Mark Bishop, whose company Apex Defense Solutions was infamous for absorbing smaller innovators like a black hole. My father and Mark had despised each other. Dad called him a vulture in a tie. Mark had called my father a quote dinosaur who didn't understand progress. Now, with Dad gone, the vulture was circling his life's work. The trust documents were clear. Megan and I were et obi corustes, but she had filed a petition to have me removed, claiming I was unfit. Ms. Ramsey's career, such as it is, has been spent in a rigid bureaucratician venton that has little bearing on reality, her lawyer continued, his voice arising with theatrical momentum. We have her service records, a series of unremarkable postings, support roles, administrative functions. There is nothing here, absolutely nothing. Tozagist, she possesses the acumen to help steer a multi-million-dollar technology firm. He was holding up a heavily redacted version of my service record, one my own lawyer had submitted. It looked thin, unimpressive. It was mint-toe. I felt the weight of the judge's gaze. He was an older man, tired, who had likely seen every flavor of familiar leg read. He looked at me, then at my file, and his expression was one of bored resignation. I was just heir, the less successful sibling, a footnote in a story about. That was the narrative Megan had crafted for my entire life. She was Thiessen, I was the shadow. She was the one we're shown who married rich, who produced it to perfect grandchildren. I was the strange, quiet one who ran away to join the military because I couldn't find my place. I remember the day I told him I'd enlisted in the Air Force. I was 19. We were in the living room of our childhood home. My father, a man of few words but deep thoughts, had simplified a flicker of something. Pride, understanding. In his eyes, my mother had wrung her hands, worried about the danger. But Megan had laughed, a short, sharp, dismissive sound. The Air Force, really, Heather, she'd said, looking me up and down, as if I were a piece of furniture she found distasteful. Couldn't get into a real college, huh? Well, at least they'll teach you how to make your bed properly. For 20 years, that had been the tone. Every promotion, every deployment was met with the same font, patronizing praise. When I met a staff sergeant, she'd sent me a card that said, "Look at you climbing that little ladder." When I got my commission through officer training school, she'd mused, "Oh, so they're letting you be a manager now. How nice." She never asked what I actually did. To her, I was just a cog in a vast, faceless machine. My life was a series of odd postmarks from places like Qatar, Germany, and South Korea. My home was a collection of temporary addresses. She saw my lack of a mortgage and a husband, not as a consequence of my career, but as proof of my failure to launch a real life. The most painful part was that she'd managed to sell this version of me to our father in his later years. After my mother passed, Dad grew more isolated. Megan and her family were there, a constant presence, filling the silence with their version of the world. A world where I was a distant, slightly embarrassing relative with a strange, unimportant job. Now, in court, she was that narrative. A lawyer called her to the stand. She glided past me table, refusing to meet my eyes. She settled into the witness box, folded her hands, and gave the judge a brave, trembling smile. "My sister, I love her," she began, her voice cracking perfectly. "But she doesn't understand this world, our father's world." He built Ramsey Dynamics. With his bare hands, it was everything to him. He was a genius, a patriot. He trusted me to protect it. She paused, looking over a team with a gaze full of faux compassion. Heather was always different. She never wanted to be a part of this. She wanted to escape, and she did. She chose a life of service, and we're all very proud of her for that. But it's a simple life, a structured life. She follows orders, she shuffles papers, she moves where they her to move. That isn't the kind of leadership Ramsey Dynamics needs. It needs someone who understands an open risk, the market. She gestured toward her husband, Mark, who nodded gravely. "Mark has been advising me. He knows this industry inside and out. He believes in Dad's vision, and with the resources of Apex, he can take it to the next level. Ensure its survival." It was a lie so audacious, so completed it was almost beautiful. My father would have rather burned his company to the ground than let Mark Bishop's conglomerate touch it. He told me so on more than one late-night call, his voice raspy with anger. "That man is a parasite, Heather. He doesn't build things, he just swallows them." Those calls were the one place I could be myself with him. In the last few years of his life, something had shifted. He'd started asking questions, not about mirroring or my duty station, but real questions. Ask about supply chain vulnerabilities in the defense sector, about cybersecurity threats, about the whispers he'd hear from his contacts at the Pentagon. I was careful, but I told him what I could. I told him I wasn't just shuffling papers. My work is about protecting our assets. "Dad," I'd explained once, "making sure the tech that keeps our people safe isn't compromised. Making sure the people we trust are actually trustworthy." A long silence had followed. Then his voice lowered, thick with meaning. "Good. You watch vultures, honey. You watch them close." He knew. Maybe not the details, but he knew. He'd put me as Corestifa, a reason. I was his failsafe, and Megan was trying to disarm me. Her lawyer finished his questioning. "So, Tobe, clear, Miss Bishop. Your sole motivation is to protect your father's legacy from a well-meaning but fundamentally unqualified sibling." "Yes," she whispered, a tear finally escaping and tracing a path down her cheek. "It's what he would have wanted." My lawyer, a quiet, methodical man named Mr. Davies, stood up. He had only a few questions. "Miss Bishop," he said calmly, "you've testified that your sister's career is in administrative support. How did you come to that conclusion?" Megan shrugged delicately. "Well, it's what she's told us. She's very private about it all. It's always classified or we can't talk about it, but after 20 years, one would expect something more. A title, a command, something tangible. The incel thing in the air, sharp and deliberate, nothing to show for it. So, you are not in fact aware of her specific role, her rank, or her commendations within the United States Air Force?" Davies asked. "No, she's some kind of officer," Megan said dismissively. "But the details, no. She was never one to share." Davies nodded slowly. "No further questions." The judge sighed, looking at the clock on the wall. "It seems fair. Ms. Ramsey, does your counsel have any rebuttal to the claims of your lack of business experience?" "We do, Your Honor," Davies said, his voice suddenly infused with a new gravity. "We have one rebuttal witness. But first, I would like to submit to the court my client's unredacted service record and a letter of commendation from her commanding officer." He walked to the clerk and handed over a thick file. A moment later, a copy was delivered to Megan's lawyer. I watched as he flipped it open. His confident smirk wavered. His eyes widened slightly. He leaned over and whispered something to Mark, who stiffened, his face going rigid. Megan looked back and forth between them, a flicker of confusion in her eyes. The judge was reading, his eyebrows slowly climbing his forehead. He put the papers down and looked at me, truly looked at me for the first time. The bored resignation was gone. In its place was a sharp, focused curiosity. "I see," he said slowly. "Lieutenant Colonel Ramsey. Impressive. Very impressive." Megan's head whipped around her. "Look at me." The name, the rank, echoed in the silent room. Lieutenant Colonel, not a paper pusher, not a junior officer in a forgotten corner of the bureaucracy. It was a rank of significant authority of command. But Davies wasn't finished. "As for our witness, Your Honor," he said, turning toward the courtroom doors, "the defense calls Brigadier General Robert Miller Tuthstand." The name meant nothing to Megan or her lawyer, but I saw Mark's face. It didn't just go pale. It went slack with utter bone-deep shock. He looked like he'd been shot. The heavy doors at the back of the courtroom, two men in dark suits, the Kinthat scream. Federal agent from 100 yards stepped inside. Between them was a man in a pristine Air Force dress uniform. On his shoulders were the single silver stars of a brigadier general. He wore an air of absolute unshakable authority. His chest was a billboard of military achievement, a rainbow of ribbons earned over 30 years of service to his country. The entire room was frozen. The court reporter stopped typing. The clerk stared mouth agape. The general strode to the witness stand and stood without waiting to be asked. He raised his right hand. After being sworn in, he sat down, his eyes locking on the judge. "General," the judge said, his voice filled with a new and profound respect, "to what do we owe the honor?" "I'm here on behalf of one of my officers," General Miller said, his voice a calm, powerful baritone that filled the room. He turned his head and looked directly at me. There was no warmth, just a deep, professional regard. "Lieutenant Ramsey." Megan was staring at Menno, her face a mask of disbelief. Her perfect tear-streaked makeup was suddenly garish. The narrative she had so carefully constructed was cracking, the foundation crumbling before her eyes. "It has come to my attention," the general continued, turning back to the judge, "that Lieutenant Colonel Ramsey's character and professional competence have been called into question in this proceeding. Let me be unambiguous. Lieutenant Colonel Ramsey is one of the finest officers under my command. She is not in an administrative role. She is a special agent with the Air Force, Official Special Investigations." A collective gasp went through the small public gallery. "OSI, the Air Force is on F. They handled everything from hile fraud and counter-espionage to felony-level crimes within the service. It was a world away from shuffling papers. For the past 18 months, the general went in, his gaze now shifting, settling with laser-like intensity on Mark Bishop. Lieutenant Colonel Ramsey has been the lead investigator on a multi-agency task force, Operation Steel Trap. This operation is a complex, deep-cover investigation into widespread defense contract fraud, targeting contractors who have been defrauding the U.S. government of hundreds of millions of dollars by substituting substandard materials and components into critical military hardware. He let that sink in. The air in the room became thick, heavy, impossible to breathe. Megan was no longer looking at me. She was looking at her husband, whose face had turned thicker of ash. He was staring at me, his mouth slightly open, a look of pure, unadulterated horror on his face. "Definitely understood. One of the primary targets of Operation Steel Trap," the general said, his voice dropping to a cold, hard edge, "is a corporation known as Apex Defense Solutions." Silence. Absolute crushings. "The CEO of that corporation is Mr. Mark Bishop." Megan made a small croaking sound. Her hand went to her mouth. The general wasn't done. He looked back at the judge. "Your Honor, Lieutenant Colonel Ramsey's transient lifelessly has been a necessary her deep cover work on this and other sensitive national security. Her supposed lack of facets is a carefully maintained proficiency legend. Her expertise is not in boardrooms, but in identifying and neutralizing complex threats to the United States Air Force and the Department of Defense. Threats that include financial malfeasance, corruption, and corporate espionage. I would argue that this makes her uniquely life to identify a vulture when chassis is won. He used my father's I felt a chill run down my spine. It was a message sent from him through him across the veil." The general finished. "Her integrity is beyond reproach. Any suggestion otherwise is not only an insult to a decorated officer, but is a calculated falsehood, likely intended to obstruct justice." He stared directly at Megan's lawyer, who looked as if he might faint. The lawyer opened his mouth, then closed it again, stammering. The judge looked from the general to Mark, then to a terrified Megan, and finally to me. He picked up his gavel. The petition to remove Lieutenant Colonel Heather Ramsay as Carusti Istinid with extreme prejudice, he declared, his voice booming with authority. In light of the testimony from General Miller, which suggests potential criminal motivations for this petition, I am granting Lieutenant Colonel Ramsay sole trusteeship and full control of Ramsay Dynamics, effective immediately pending the outcome of any and all federal investigations. He banged the gavel once. The sound cracked through the room like a gunshot. And Mr. Bishop, the judge added, high size like chips of ice, I would advise you not to leave the jurisdiction. It was over. As the judge swept out of the room, the two suits who had entered with the general moved. They didn't run. They walked calmly and deliberately neared the table and stood behind Mark Bishop. One of them said quietly, "You're under arrest." Megan screamed, a raw guttural sound of her entire world imploding. She lunged toward him, but the other agent gently blocked her path. They cuffed him, his expensive suit suddenly looking cheap and ill-fit. His face was a void. He stood up and smoothed down my suit. I gathered my portfolio. Mr. Davies gave my shoulder a gentle squeeze. General Miller walked over to him. "Good work, Colonel," he said, his voice low. "Your father would be proud." "Thank you, sir," I replied, my own voice steady, though my heart was hammering against my ribs. I turned to leave, and there was Megan. Her face was a ruin. The makeup was a mess, her eyes wide with a dawning horrified understanding of everything she had so catastrophically misunderstood. She saw him now, not the strange failed the sister. She saw Lieutenant Colonel Inth, OSI, who had just dismantled her entire life without raising her voice. "Heather," she whispered, her voice. "Heather, I didn't know." I looked at the woman who had marked my uniform, belittled my service, and tried to steal my father's legacy with a smile on her face. I've not no pity, no anger, just a vast, cold emptiness where a sister's love is to be. "No, Megan," I said, my voice quiet but clear. You never bothered to look." I turned and walked out of the courtroom, leaving her alone in the wreckage. Outside, the sun was bright. I took a deep breath. Thessity air tasting of freedom and a justice that was 20 years in the making. "My name is Heather Ramsay,"